Thanks for joining us, everyone that's tuning in for our continuing conversation series that we call the Reformation, in which we're engaging experts like Ken Powley, who I'm excited to have a conversation with, to syndicate and share what's happening in the reform movement, what are the efforts underway, cross-partisan, to help heal our democracy. So, Ken, thank you so much for being with me for a few minutes here.
Our pleasure.
So, Ken, you have an interesting background. You're the CEO and co-founder of Team Democracy. We'll talk about what that is. But prior to that, you had a 46-year career at the helm of a whitewater rafting company. So you have a background in entrepreneurship, in the great outdoors. You and your wife, Penny, are proud parents of 3. You got kids, I know, in Kiev as well, or grandchildren, rather, in Kiev. So I want to get into this. How do you go from running a whitewater rafting company for 46 years to founding an organization called Team Democracy?
All my best friends ask me that question, and it's a good question because I didn't see this coming either. I was sitting actually right here at my kitchen counter on January 6th, and I was working on some marketing stuff for the rafting business, and the TV was on behind me, background noise. And it was all about the big rally in DC, and I wasn't paying much attention to it. And then around the middle of the day, I started watching it a little bit more. It was kind of surprising, and then it became increasingly disturbing. And then I couldn't take my eyes off of it. And by the end of the day, I just was. I had one of those aha moments where you go, "Wow, I'm literally watching democracy slipping through our fingers in real time." And I was up that night late. I had a sleepless night. The next morning, I sat down here again and I started putting some thoughts on paper. And I shared those with family members. And one of my wife's brothers wrote me back a very thoughtful letter. And that was the beginning of a conversation that's gone on every day for a year and a half. And will probably go on for many years to come. It was so crystal clear to me that the solution to this problem of polarization wasn't going to be fixed from the top down. Democracy always requires the people being governed to get engaged and to force change. And so, you look in the mirror and you go, well, hey, that's me. Yeah, I'm a rafting guy, but I understand there's a real serious existential problem here. Got to be addressed. If I'm not going to do it, who's going to do it? So that was essentially the day I retired. Was January 7th, and started working on this full time. Chris Newland, who is our co-founder, one of us is a lifelong conservative. One of us is an avowed liberal. We refuse to tell anybody which is which. And most people can't figure it out, which is really interesting. But we developed the concept, took it first to General Hayden, and he was extremely receptive to it. He took it to a number of his colleagues like General McChrystal and Hertling and Lute and Clapper. And before we knew it, we had all 5 of them in a studio filming a call to action video about Team Democracy, about the elections pledge. And we were off and running at that point. So it was a quick transition. It was one we did not expect. I didn't expect, but as they say, duty calls, and so we respond as best we can.
So, what is Team Democracy, and what is the pledge?
Well, the concept is that there are a number of underpinnings of a healthy democracy, a number of things that keep a democracy strong. The 2 really most critical cornerstones are elections that we have confidence in and the peaceful transfer of power. And January 6th, what we were watching was both of those being thrown under the bus. And so Chris and I looked at this and said, we need what the country needs. Polarization, the problem of polarization can only be addressed by finding points of commonality, by finding common ground. Now, there's a lot of common ground organizations out there, but we wanted to focus on the existential threats to democracy, which are safe and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power. So we created the pledge. We worked with a number of people on both sides of the aisle for about 3 or 4 months, including folks from the Carter Center, from conservative groups, and fine-tuned the language to make sure it was completely free of any partisan language, buzzwords, hot button words. And the concept is to approach this as both a grassroots and a grass tops effort. We're going out to the general public with the pledge saying, look, it's really important for you to sign this and to then connect with your elected officials and your candidates to encourage them to sign it. And we're also going out to every candidate for House, Senate, Governor, and Secretary of State in 2022, and saying this is a nonpartisan commitment to elections that are safe and secure, and the rejection of violence to overthrow election results. It's so simple. It's such a low bar. You would think everybody could sign this. And we are getting a ton of signatures. There's still some folks holding out. But I think in every campaign, that's going to play out in its own unique way. But we're very pleased with the direction it's gone and the pace that it's gone.
How do you get the people that need to sign the pledge to care about the pledge? And because I respect the effort, which is we want this presented as a nonpartisan way, and presumably this idea of free and fair elections and peaceful transfer of power should be sort of beyond controversy and beyond partisanship. But we know that we have a fractured system. So let me ask you differently. Where does the opposition come from, and what are the reasons for the opposition? I don't think anyone thinks of themselves as not being patriots in this moment. So the question is, what's the conversation you're having there?
We expected the resistance to come from the more extreme ends of both political parties. What we have found, to our surprise, is that candidates are signing this pledge, including candidates from the extreme fringes. And after signing it, they're making there's an option to include a pledge statement, an optional pledge statement. So candidates can write in whatever comments they want. And some of them come from a completely different set of background facts. And they're all the talking points of the extreme right and the extreme left. And so what that has taught us is that even those folks, on the Capitol steps breaking into the Capitol building on January 6th, share the conviction that elections ought to be secure. What really angered them was they had been convinced that elections were not secure. They really wanted elections that reflected the will of the people. What they had been convinced of was that the elections didn't reflect the will of the people. So there's not disagreement. There's really not disagreement, even on the edges of the political spectrum, about those cornerstones. We want the same things. The devil's in the details, how you talk it out. So signing the pledge has been less of a challenge than we expected it would. And we've frankly gotten more support from parts of the political spectrum that we thought were unreachable. Turns out they're very reachable.
Mm. It is. How do you think about this work? Is it near-term kind of crisis intervention work, or is it long-term? What's your kind of vision for success? I mean, what's sort of the best case scenario for team democracy? Everyone signs the pledge.
There was a fascinating turn of events in the 2020 Utah gubernatorial race. I don't know if you've ever seen the video of Spencer Cox and Chris Peterson. They were running for governor, one a Democrat, one a Republican, in an election cycle that was uniquely toxic. I mean, it was hard to watch political ads in 2020. They decided to get in front of the camera and talk to the voters of Utah together, both of them. And they were very frank about the fact that they disagreed on almost every issue you could imagine, but that they were in total agreement on the fundamental importance of elections, of voter participation, of the rule of law, and they promised the voters of Utah that no matter who wins, they would respect one another and work together for the good of all the people of Utah. And that 30-second combined ad that they did went viral all over the country. The media was hungry for that message. Voters were hungry for that message. I'm in Pennsylvania. That ad played here in Pennsylvania for almost a week. And newscasters teared up after playing it and said, why can't we have more of that? That's the kind of messaging that we believe we can duplicate time and time and time again. Cox and Peterson were the precursors of this election pledge. If we can get candidates to simply agree on the fundamental cornerstones of democracy like they did, we'll have that messaging in front of the public. If we can get candidates to encourage their constituents to sign on for the pledge, we'll have a groundswell of public support. It takes both. We need the public to be re-engaged in this, and we've got a lot of plans for doing that. We need more candidates to outwardly express what Cox and Peterson did in 2020, and what candidates are now doing this year. We just launched this a little over a month ago. September 15th was our official launch, the International Day of Democracy. We've got almost 200 candidates on board in a few weeks. Between now and 2024, we believe we can make massive inroads across the political spectrum in all 50 states and really have an impact on the dialogue, the narrative, and getting positive messaging in front of voters so that voters are not just so fed up with politics. You know, I'm one of those guys that was fed up with politics. I just didn't pay attention to it. It was all negative. Now I see a pathway for turning that around. And the other important part of this, I never signed a petition or a pledge in my life. I frankly think most of them are you sign it and it goes on a shelf somewhere and everybody forgets about it. This one we have built on a technology platform that allows every citizen signer to immediately have displayed, as soon as he hits the submit button, what displays on his screen is a ballot view, all of his candidates, all of his elected officials, where he can click on each one and send a message, email or Twitter, saying, I've just signed this election pledge. I believe in democracy. It's important to me. If you want my support, you need to sign it too. You need to be on board with these cornerstones of democracy. That connection between voters and candidates and their elected representatives is enormously powerful. We've talked with Brian Baird and Jim Gerlach from the co-chairs of the former members of Congress. And Brian has, every time we've talked with him, he keeps reminding us, you know, as an incumbent, if my staff gets a dozen emails from constituents about an issue, that's enough to get my attention. I start looking, I start digging, I start trying to understand what's going on. We don't need to get millions of Americans to do this. We need a few dozen in every race to take the pledge themselves as voters and then make the click on the candidate's name and let them know that this matters. And we can start to move the needle. If we can move the needle 5 or 10%, that's a huge win. And we've got enough time now. We entered 2022 thinking we're just going to get our feet on the ground, do a few things, test the waters, develop a proof of concept so that we're ready for 2024. We expected a dozen or two candidates to sign it, not 200. So suddenly we've got the tiger by the tail and it's taken off. And, you know, we're trying to create the bandwidth to engage every one of those candidates, because every one of those candidates who does sign it becomes a potential megaphone within his district. He's got access to social media, traditional media, constituents, and every one of those candidate signers can become a real force for good in this effort. So by the time we get to 2024, organizationally, we need to have the bandwidth to engage every one of those candidates and maximize their impact as the campaign progresses.
How do you ensure that, or how do you think about people that might be signing the pledge now that have a different interpretation of what the events on January 6th were, or subsequent conversations around the election? How do you know that they have a shared kind of interpretation as to what signing the pledge means going forward? Does that make
They,
sense?
yeah. Well, okay. Let's take the parts of the pledge.
Mm.
First part: elections need to be secure. There's not a lot of people out there saying, I'm really in favor of elections that we can't have any confidence. I'm really in favor of voting machines that are corruptible. That's not the issue. The other part of the pledge is we want elections to be accessible to eligible voters, readily accessible to eligible voters. There's not a lot of folks who are claiming that it's healthy for democracy for eligible voters not to be able to vote. We don't have disagreement on that.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, when we sit around a table and work out the details of how we make elections more secure while also keeping them accessible to voters, do we want to have a group of people talking about this who don't trust each other, who don't see any common ground at all, who think that the opposition is an existential threat to them, and who need to win every point in order to go home happy? Or do we want to have around the table folks who still have those same disagreements about how it should be done, but who have a trust of each other, that we share the belief that, yes, we shouldn't be making elections more secure at the expense of voter participation. And no, we don't want every imaginable voter to participate if it means the elections are not secure. So those details have to be worked out, but it's just changing the narrative, the perspective that comes from recognizing that you really do have shared interests. You really do believe in the same core values. If you look at the third element of the pledge is we're not going to try to overturn election results using violence. And again, there's overwhelming support of that on both sides of the aisle, and most Republicans will not show up at the Capitol to storm the building. Even if you look at the crowd that day, it wasn't all 20 or 30,000 who went down and stormed it. It was a subset of those, and others wandered away and said, "This is not for me." And some of those folks came with that intent in mind, in all likelihood. So I think the core underpinnings of the pledge, despite your different mindset or your different fact base that you come to it with, the core elements of the pledge are widely, almost universally accepted.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you the question that someone rhetorically asked you, or no, it was the newscaster that rhetorically asked, which is, why can't we get more of this? And seeing the ad in Utah, right, the 30-second spot of Republican Democrats saying, "Hey, we're going to act differently." Given how popular that was, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, like, let's think about the incentive structure for why people do the opposite. Why do candidates do the opposite than what we want, right? So often. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I'm operating on the belief that people do whatever is incentivized for them to do. They're doing things not in spite of the incentives, but because of them. What are you seeing as the incentives for behavior, and how do we change that?
Well, this is why it needs to be grassroots and grass tops. The more Americans become involved in this movement, the safer it is for a candidate or a politician to get on board and say, "Yeah, I can stand up. I can stand up for safe and fair elections and nonviolence." You're absolutely right that every candidate makes the decision: is this in my self-interest to sign this and to adhere to it? I think what we're finding over the last couple of months, the political landscape is always ebbing and flowing and shifting around. What you're seeing in recent months is folks to the right of center who are running for office a little less enthusiastic about going out to the very edge, but they don't see a clear path for staking a claim to a more moderate position in a way that isn't risky. And so that's what we're giving them. We're giving them a mechanism where they can make this really incredibly low bar pledge that says, I'm a traditional American patriot who believes in elections, and the peaceful transfer of power, and doing it with a community of other candidates. So he's not, it's not like standing up all by yourself and having a target on your back and being picked off by a sniper. It's doing it in a growing movement where it's increasingly acceptable. We have to make it increasingly safe and acceptable for politicians of all stripes to espouse fundamental cornerstones of democracy and do it in a way that's not risky. Some will make the calculation that it's still too early, and I get that. But our goal is that by 2024, it's much more widely known and understood. I mean, think about it. We're going to candidates, they've never heard of us at this point. They've never heard of Team Democracy, and we're showing up on their doorstep with a pledge. It's a miracle that anybody signed it. By 2024, we expect to be such an ingrained part of the political narrative that it just simply becomes the right thing to do and a safe thing to do. So I have every confidence we're going to get there.
This will be my last question, Ken. Are you optimistic? You are optimistic because you said that we have every confidence that we're going to get there. How do you see the next chapter unfolding here? Going from running a whitewater rafting company to now running this, scrambling to get elected officials and candidates to sign a pledge, of which you've got 200. I mean, what have you learned about where this country is today and where it's headed, and how does that make you feel?
Well, first of all, I've learned that I am a sponge for knowledge, and that I started this with the understanding that I knew nothing about it. So every meeting I've had with every leader of every nonprofit and every candidate and everybody in the national security industry, I just soak up everything they can tell me. It's just really fun meeting a lot of people who are so much smarter than you are yourself. And so, when we started this, we honestly thought that we would be well accepted in the nonprofit bridging community, the common ground community, all those groups that focus on civility and dialogue. It was a shock to us that our first and most enthusiastic partners in this were out of the national security space. It was General Hayden, it was the other generals, it was nonprofits like the Steady State and National Security Leaders for America. And it became crystal clear that our support from groups like that and from veterans groups like your own is predicated on the fact that, folks in that community recognize that this problem isn't just an inconvenience. It's not just a weakening of our democracy. It's really an existential threat to our national security. General Hayden, off camera when we were filming, looked at me and he said, we in this intelligence and military community, we have a playbook. We know that tells us how to deal with North Korea or Russia or China or Iran or any of the rest of it. He says, we don't have a playbook for what's happening in America today. And he said in his almost 50 years in the military and the Air Force and intelligence, he says he never confronted anything that scares him the way this scares him today. And he says, because we don't have a ready solution. We don't have experience with this. This is really new. And so when, former CIA director tells you that he's concerned in a way that he's never been concerned, it's sobering, but it explains why veterans groups, military groups, intelligence agency groups take this so seriously and are so motivated to try to make a change in any way we can. And so we really treasure the support that you and so many others have given to this mission.
Ken, we're proud to be friends and partners in this effort. So thank you for the time and the conversation. I really enjoyed it. We'll make sure folks can stay engaged with you in the great and important work of Team Democracy and challenge their candidates and elected officials to sign the pledge as well. I agree with what you said. I'll end on this, just that the power is going to come from citizens. And the grass tops are important, but the power is with people. And I think we both believe that. So thanks for the time today.
You guys are the best. Thanks so much.
All right, Ken. Thank you.